now for something completely different.
It's the Bitchspot Report. Welcome to the Bitchspot Report, the atheist podcast that isn't afraid to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We hope we can entertain, engage, and perhaps even enrage you with discussions of religion, politics, and beyond. Now let's begin this episode of the Bitchspot Report. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bitchspot Report. I'm your host, Cephus. Yes, it's just me this week. I was away over the weekend at WonderCon, and when I came back, I couldn't find anyone who was available to come on and talk with me this week. Oh well, the show must go on. I want to repeat what I said last week. We're still looking for a permanent co-host, or maybe even a couple of rotating regular guest hosts. If I could find 4 good people who are willing to come on for an hour or 2 a month, I'd be a really happy guy. Also, if anyone has any suggestions for the podcast, I'd love to hear them. I've gotten a couple of ideas for new segments that I want to try out over the next couple of weeks. The original idea that we had was to have a wide variety of possible segments and then pick a couple for each show so it's not always the same thing. I know I've said this in the past, and I will say it again in the future, but listener feedback is very, very important to us. And so far, it's been like staring into a black hole. We're just not getting that many ideas or suggestions. The contact information can be found at the end of the show. Please listen and let us know. And now, on with the show. You know, I'm just going to do this completely off the cuff because it's just something that's been kind of pissing me off, and I think it's really important. It's something that's a fundamental part and a basic part of conservatism, and that's personal responsibility. It's doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. Now, over the weekend, I was at WonderCon. I have a very good friend who has a blog. It's not a religious blog or anything like that. It's actually a history blog. But he was going to be at WonderCon with me, and he had asked somebody if they would do a guest post on his blog. Well, actually, they had offered to said, hey, if you ever want me to do a guest post on your blog, I'd be happy to do it. So he took them up on their offer and said, would you do it for me for this particular day? And the guy says, yeah, no problem. And I know he asked this guy weeks in advance. I mean, he told me about it at least 2 weeks beforehand. I don't know how long he actually asked this other guy. But he says, sure, I'd be happy to do it. That's not a problem. You can count on me. So anyway, the weeks go by and the weeks go by, and he's, my friend is saying on his blog, hey, we're going to have this guest post by this person, on this day. So everybody make sure you look for it. And he's like building it up and building it up. And this guy never sends the post. And he keeps asking, where's the post? Where's the post? Oh, I'll get to it. Okay. It's going to be done. It has to be posted on this day. Oh, no problem. I'll get it done. He never got it done. He didn't do a damn thing. And, my friend was kind of pissed. I mean, I would be too. If you make a commitment, you get it done. If you promise to do something, you do it. And this guy just kind of blew the whole thing off, and he said at the end, well, I just never got around to it. It's just a blog. Who cares? Well, apparently somebody cared. My friend cared. He cared enough to, ask you to do it. You cared enough to offer in the first place. I get so sick and tired of that, and the world seems to be going more and more that way, where people just blow shit off because it's inconvenient, or it doesn't matter, or, nobody has that kind of personal responsibility anymore where they say, I will do X, and they follow through and do X. A couple of weeks ago, Hausdorff asked me to do a guest post on his blog. Love his blog, all right? He jumped in and says, hey, I'm going to be away for a week or so. I'm looking for people to do guest posts. Would you do one? And I said, absolutely, I'll do one. No problem. Not only did I do one, I did a very, very in-depth, lengthy, with a lot of research post that probably took me 6 to 8 hours to complete. Now, I didn't have to do it. I get nothing for posting on his blog. I get nothing at all. All right? But I do it because he's a friend, because I said I would do it. And it would have been easier for me to just kind of go, who cares? I don't have to do it. It's not important. But my word matters. And unfortunately, so many people's word just doesn't matter anymore. And they don't want to be blamed or criticized or anything else for not following through on what they say they're going to do. You know? I mean, if you say you're going to be a guest on a podcast, you should show up. All right? You should just, if you say you're going to be there, unless you have a really good reason. And yeah, there may be good reasons. All right? I was in the hospital. I was sick, whatever. There may be some really excellent reasons why you can't do it. But you have at least the responsibility to let the people know that I'm not going to do it so you can make other plans. You know, you don't show up for the podcast drunk. You don't show up for the podcast unprepared. You don't just blow the whole thing off and say, hey, I'm just not going to do it. You don't refuse, you know, you keep your word. And I don't understand people, liberals, conservatives, you name it. I don't understand people whose word means nothing at all and who don't give a damn. And that's what pisses me off this week. And now the news.
When you ask, for example, I had an interview with Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council. What is it about calling a gay union marriage that offends you? How does it hurt a traditional or heterosexual marriage? And I didn't hear anything articulated that was particularly persuasive. What people go back to...
And I agree with you 100%.
Right.
100%. And I hate to say this, Kelly. And next week I got something to Kelly that she's not going to like.
Oh.
I agree with you 100%.
Wow, okay.
The compelling argument is on the side of homosexuals. Mm-hmm. That's where the compelling argument is. We're Americans. We just want to be treated like everybody else. That is a compelling argument. And to deny that, you've got to have a very strong argument on the other side.
And the other
side hasn't been able to do anything but thump the Bible.
Their best argument thus far has been, well, marriage is an institution that for 2,000 years has been about a man and a woman creating babies.
That's
and
right.
Procreation.
The procreation is a strong...
But look how society has changed.
Yes, believe it or not, that was Bill O'Reilly. It's amazing how many right-wing neocons are willing to change their minds when the wind starts blowing the other way, isn't it? This story comes from the Raw Story. Bill O'Reilly says same-sex marriage foes are just a bunch of Bible thumpers. Haven't we been saying that for a while? Fox News host Bill O'Reilly knocked opponents of same-sex marriage, claiming they had a weak argument that relied entirely on religious beliefs. All right, now what weird parallel universe did I just wander into? While discussing the current debate in the Supreme Court with co-host Megyn Kelly, O'Reilly said that public policy should not be based on religious belief. Kelly said that once you remove religion, the arguments against gay marriage are very, very weak, and Bill agreed. All right, now I'll be honest. I don't pay any attention whatsoever to most of the far right-wing religious nuts and political ideologues. I don't listen to O'Reilly. I don't listen to Sean Hannity. I try my hardest not to listen to Rush Limbaugh, although he's on the talk station I listen to in the morning, and if I happen to be in the car at the time and he's not being too much of a blowhard, I might hang in for a bit. But in general, I'm not the kind of guy who sits around and listens to people toot their own horns, and that's what these people tend to do. Of the three people I mentioned, though, I've always found O'Reilly to be the least offensive of the three. In the same sense, I suppose that herpes is the least offensive STD you might have in a list of sexually transmitted diseases you don't want to get. But I have to wonder, it seems like not a week goes by when some previously hardline anti-gay Republican isn't coming out and saying they've changed their minds. We remember not too long ago when Rob Portman came out in favor of gay marriage. Now you've got people like Jeff Flake and Mark Kirk who now support marriage equality. Even the aforementioned Rush Limbaugh has admitted that gay marriage is inevitable, and conservatives, well, you better make that neoconservatives, Rush, have lost the fight. The march toward equality is moving whether the religious retards want it to or not. Now that it seems like it's going to happen, it'll be interesting to see how many former staunch anti-gay advocates are going to turn their boats around and sail the other direction. There are a couple of online voting polls to see who the next Republican to toss away the religious party line and join the future will be. And to be honest, it's about damn time. I do want to correct people on something that I see all the time. This is in regards to actual conservatism, not the absurd neoconservatism that we see a lot in the Republican higher-ups. But liberals seem to think that being a conservative means you're going to cling desperately to tradition no matter what happens. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, we do cling to tradition because, so far at least, tradition has worked. That's how it got to be a tradition in the first place. However, we're not adverse to changing our minds if the change is actually called for. If a demonstrably better way comes down the pike, we'll adopt it if it's actually better than what we had before. That's the case with gay marriage. A lot of actual conservatives have adopted it because it's better than the traditional marriage that we've had. The same was true of interracial marriage. You have to remember that the exact same arguments that were made 60 years ago are being made today. That marriage was between a man and a woman of the same race and nothing else. But enough people jumped on the equality bandwagon to make a difference. And that's what's happening right now. All right, granted it's not happening so much on the neocon side. They are not willing to change their heartfelt religious traditions for anything, but maybe that's why they're failing so bad in the elections. Society has changed, and they refuse to change. Society may evolve entirely beyond the need for them. Hopefully that's true, and we can get back to a Republican Party that's made up primarily of actual conservatives, not these hyper-religious fiscal liberals that have ruined the party for the last 40 years. The next story comes from the Telegraph in England. BBC accused of provoking Christians with Mary Magdalene documentary. The former Bishop of Rochester, Michael Nazir Ali, has accused the BBC of purposely provoking Christians by airing a documentary hosted by Melvin Bragg, which argued that Jesus had a sexual relationship with Mary Magdalene. According to Nazir Ali, it was hugely offensive to devout Christians because it sexualized Jesus. Worse, he said that the BBC had purposely aired the documentary at midday on Good Friday when Christians believed that Jesus was nailed to the cross. Now, I'm going to say something that I've said many times before, that nobody has a right not to be offended. If something you see offends you, stop looking at it. That's the same advice I'd give to Muslims who seem to get pissed off at, well, pretty much everything. The idea that everything on the planet has to cater to your particular beliefs is absolutely absurd, and someone really needs to tell you people to grow up. All right, I guess it's going to have to be me. All you religious fucktards, grow the fuck up. In his defense, Bragg, who describes himself as no longer a believer, points to various Gnostic Gospels which describe the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene quite differently than in the official biblical narrative. They describe Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene on the mouth. They refer to her as being his favorite, and, in one case, as his wife. These were the same sources that were used by Dan Brown when he wrote the Da Vinci Code, and I think in the movie version, if you haven't seen it, it does a very good job of kind of giving an overview of the evidence. While I don't know that the Gnostic Gospels are any more compelling than the Gospels that actually made it into the Bible, it is an interesting bit of story that might change how people view the actual Bible. And that pisses off a lot of Christians. According to Nazir Ali, I am concerned about the misuses of very obscure Gnostic Gospels to impugn the integrity of the Bible. Bible? Integrity? Bueller? The Bible has no integrity. It's just a story. The vast majority of things described in the Bible, whether believers like it or not, never really happened. It's mostly myth. Faith doesn't change the facts. Nazir Ali goes on to say, and I find this hysterical, biblical Christians are not given any kind of response to this. Well, of course they are. They don't have to watch it. If it really strikes their fancy, they can respond online all they want. They can file complaints. The only thing they can't do is stop it from airing. And I suspect that's really what he wanted to happen. Whenever something happens that makes your side look bad, it's funny how believers want to censor that content. But when they can do something that makes someone else look bad, they scream freedom of speech and expression and religion. If you want to respond, respond. Knock yourself out. But you don't want to respond. You want to control. You want to squelch ideas and expression. And that's just not something you're free to do. I also find it funny that Christian groups are bitching about the time that it was aired. According to Andrea Williams, director of Christian Concern, noon Good Friday is the precise time Christians are remembering Jesus' crucifixion. To air a program which questions the purity of Christ is at best insensitive and at worst offensive. Guys, if this is the time you idiots are remembering Jesus' crucifixion, what the fuck are you doing watching TV in the first place? Jesus, you people are idiots. Next comes a story from the Pennsylvania Daily Local News. Pastor starved his daughter over homework. Police have charged Pastor Mark Hooper with child endangerment after he and his wife refused to feed their 9-year-old homeschooled daughter until she finished her homework to their satisfaction. Hooper, pastor of the Cobb Street Baptist Church, had starved his daughter to such a degree that when she finally ran away from home last month, she weighed just 31 pounds and had the bone structure of a 5-year-old. The daughter is one of 3 that were adopted by the Hoopers, and all have been moved to foster homes while the abuse is investigated. According to the girl, she was also not allowed to use the restroom until she had gotten every answer on her math homework right. Susan Hooper would deny her request, and if she wet herself, she would be spanked and not fed all day. While examining the underweight girl, doctors found that she had never seen a doctor nor received an immunization in her life. I wish I could say this was a rare thing, but it's not. And certainly it's not among the religious, where this seems to pop up all the time. This is really the kind of story that prompted me to start the Religious Horror Show. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a feature on my blog where I detail the horrors of religion, specifically for those people who say that religion is harmless. Religion is anything but harmless. Religion is very, very dangerous, if not physically, then emotionally and mentally. While yes, most people don't get beaten or starved or killed because of their religious beliefs or the beliefs of their parents, it is a significant problem. The more fanatical one is about their beliefs, the more extreme they're willing to get with regard to their own health and safety or the health and safety of their children. It's just such a painful problem. In this case, the poor girl was only as tall as a 5-year-old and had significant health problems due to her prolonged abuse. She has serious liver problems and will likely have health issues for as long as she lives. She, unfortunately, is one of the lucky ones. There are far too many children who don't just suffer health problems from their religious abuse, they wind up dead. There are a lot of Christian religious groups out there who just don't believe in any health care whatsoever for themselves or their children. When their child comes down with a disease or a condition, even if it's very easily treatable, they'd rather watch their child wither away and die while they pray than take them to a doctor or get them a prescription. Very, very, very easily treatable conditions have resulted in horribly painful deaths in children whose religious parents refuse to care for them responsibly. Religion is not responsible. Prayer is not useful. God is not going to save your child. There's no reason to think there is a God in the first place. And the worst thing is, even though there have been laws passed in many states that require the parents to take their children to the doctor, so many still refuse to do it. Religion, especially extremist religion, is a disease, and it's something that all of us, every single one of us, have to work to stop. North Carolina Republicans pushed bill for state religion. This comes from NBCnews.com. Republican lawmakers in North Carolina have introduced a bill declaring that the state has the right to establish an official state religion, a clear violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, granted, this is North Carolina we're talking about here, and like a lot of other former Confederate states, well, I don't know that they lost the Civil War. Why should we be surprised they don't understand the Constitution? The bill argues that the federal government does not have the right to prohibit states from adopting official state religions or from keeping religious instruction out of public schools. While this bill does not specify a particular religion of which North Carolina wants to adopt, it's a no-brainer for anybody who wants to think about it. Just last month, the ACLU filed suit against the Rowan County Commission from opening their meetings with Christian-specific prayers. One of those prayers contained the words, "There is only one way to salvation, and that is Jesus Christ," because that's not a specific religion, right? According to the same chapter of the ACLU, North Carolina lawmakers fundamentally misunderstand constitutional law and the principle of the separation of powers that dates back to the founding of this country. As I said, are we surprised? Michael Blitzer, professor at Catawba College, says that the bill is based on the discredited idea that states can exempt themselves from federal law. According to him, we saw this in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, the belief that the states hold more power than the federal government. If the federal government does something, the states can simply ignore it. Of course, this is simply not true. Although, to be honest, the claim comes up all the time when you're debating libertarians who seem to think that the states have all the power and the federal government is an alien parasite that is somehow imposed on all of us and we have to do everything we can to get out from under it. This is really a ridiculous belief and, well, like so many other things that the libertarians hold, which makes their platform and belief so utterly laughable, this bill is also laughable. It's like the talk of Texas seceding a couple years ago. It's just not going to happen. In part, the bill reads, "The North Carolina General Assembly does not recognize federal court rulings which prohibit and otherwise regulate the state of North Carolina, its public schools, or any political subdivisions of the state from making laws respecting an establishment of religion." Sorry? You as a state voted back in the day to become part of the Union, and part of that agreement was that you would follow federal mandates. You don't get to opt out now because you're just a bunch of religious retards desperately trying to cling to your beliefs. What next? Are you going to decide you don't like the 1967 Supreme Court ruling that overturned the North Carolina law against interracial marriage? Hell, maybe you want to go back to owning slaves and will declare that you don't respect the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. You don't get to be part of a union and benefit from your membership and then tell the union to go fuck off because you don't like what you already agreed to. This reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend recently, and yes, this is digressing a lot, but it was a discussion about sovereign citizens, those lunatics who think they can magically declare themselves nations unto themselves, not pay taxes, but still use all the benefits that any citizen of the United States has. They still drive on our roads, they still go to our stores, they still use our banks, they still use the hospitals, and if their house is burning down, they still call the fire department, even though they think they shouldn't have to pay for any of it. Guys, if you want to declare your independence from the United States, it's really easy. Go to a foreign embassy and legally reject your United States citizen, and then go away! As far as I'm concerned, you cannot sit on American soil getting American benefits while denying you are an American. Go find an island somewhere and live in your imaginary sovereign nation. Unless you have the balls to legally and officially renounce your citizen, you're still bound by the laws of the nation to which you officially belong. That includes paying taxes, you fucktards. And that goes for North Carolina as well. If you guys don't want to honor the agreements that your forefathers signed, pack up, renounce your citizen, and get the fuck out of the country. No, you can't just keep the land. That belongs to the United States. Take all the stuff you can carry and march off into the ocean and find somewhere else to live. This is the United States. This is not the 50 states who just so happen to be next to each other. Damn, I hate fucking stupidity.
This is the Leave It!
This week I wanted to get into something that I've talked about on and off for a while on the blog. See, I don't consider myself to be part of the quote-unquote atheist community. In fact, I think the very idea that such a community exists is a bit absurd. It goes back to the very definition of atheism, which is a lack of belief in a god or gods. That's all it means. It's not a positive attribute in the sense that it tells you something positive about a person's beliefs, positions, or conclusions. It tells you they don't believe in gods. Atheism isn't a thing. It's a lack of a thing. The second you start talking about any positive attribute, you stop talking about atheism and started talking about something else. If I speak out in favor of gay rights, for instance, I'm not speaking out of my atheism, but out of something different. If I say I like Star Trek, I'm not talking atheistically. I'm talking out of my geekdom. I, like everyone else, wear many different hats, and I understand the need to change hats depending on the subject matter I'm talking about. Unfortunately, far too many people just don't get that. In my opinion, this is a major, major problem in the so-called atheist community. There are far too many people who desperately want to bring everything they believe and think and desire together under a single banner. They want to stamp the atheist label on their forehead and have it mean a whole bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, that's just not how things work. We have language for a reason, to facilitate concise communication with others. Words have specific meanings for a reason. We can't just point to a dog and decide to call it a tree. Nobody would understand what we were talking about. However, there has been a movement, quote unquote, among some atheists who clearly don't get what words actually mean. They want to consolidate their own particular brand of, usually far left-wing beliefs under the banner of atheism. I'm not here to give a linguistics lesson. It's clear that what they're trying to call atheism is not about atheism. And worse yet, some of them are demanding that you can't be an atheist unless you embrace their social and political agenda, which is absurd on its face. I'm also not here to talk about Atheism Plus. When we started this podcast, one of my first demands was that groups like Atheism Plus would receive as little airtime as I could possibly give them. There are far too many podcasts, blogs, and forums out there that spend almost all their time talking about radical social justice issues, and just as many podcasts, blogs, and forums dedicated to trolling and otherwise attacking those same people. I don't want to be part of the problem. Therefore, I purposely opted out. In fact, as anyone who reads my blog knows, my one and only New Year's resolution this year was to walk away from any and all discussions and debates on Atheism Plus. I stopped reading any blog that was primarily concerned with supporting or attacking A+. I dropped any podcast that did the same. I unfollowed people on Twitter whose only purpose was to either support or bitch about social justice topics, and I stopped reading the Atheism Plus hashtag entirely. I didn't block anybody, but I just largely stopped paying attention, and now I only see a few posts on it, occasionally on a few blogs that I do follow where it's very, very rarely discussed. I think it's done wonders to keep me out of the debacle, and I'm a lot happier for it. That said, that's not the state of the atheist community today, where a lot of very vocal people on both sides wage war across a ton of blogs, podcasts, and forums, and this online warfare has taken center stage in a lot of discussions. We've allowed all of this non-atheist nonsense to distract us from what we really ought to be concerned with, demonstrating the absurdity and harm of religion. Within the last week, a whole shit ton of atheist groups and organizations signed an open letter to the secular community in which they laid out suggestions for getting past this nonsense. Some of it I agree with, some of it I vehemently do not. I wanted to take this time to go through their points one by one and discuss them and see what comes up. I'm going to look at these points in order. I've given a link in the show notes so you can go and read the entire letter for yourself. I don't want anyone to take my word for it. I think you ought to go and do your own research and rationally and critically evaluate the arguments given. After all, isn't that what atheists and skeptics are supposed to do? The first point, as I will read in full, says, moderate blogs and forums. Any organization or individual engaged in blogging or administering a forum has an obligation to moderate comments. Slurs, threats, and so forth beget more of the same. Keeping our online spaces free of these elements creates a civil climate that makes it much easier for people to engage in issues protectively. I absolutely disagree with this position. All right, now granted, my blog is moderated and always has been, but that's only to keep spam to a minimum. My comment policy is very, very lax. I'll only moderate your comment if it is a direct attack or threat on another commenter. Otherwise, you're welcome to use whatever slurs you want, whatever language you want, and that reflects on you, not me. If you want to go running around calling people niggers and bitches and cunts and whatever, knock yourself out. Doesn't affect me at all. It just makes you look like an idiot. Of course, I'm not telling you what you can and cannot do on your own blog, podcast, or forum. You own it. You have every right to do whatever you want to do, just like I have every right to tell you what an idiot I think you are for doing it, if I feel so inclined. However, there are definitely blogs and forums out there that are very, 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 very heavily moderated, to the point that I'd argue they become little more than an echo chamber, where the only voices that are allowed to be heard are the ones spouting the exact party line. And then they have the gall to say, see, everybody agrees. Well, of course they do, you dipshit. You deleted everyone who didn't agree with you. I do agree that we ought to discuss matters civilly, if at all possible. But more important than that, we ought to discuss matters rationally. This is where everything tends to go sideways. Most of the issues that are most contentious are not rational. To listen to many of the people who advocate them, you'd think they came out of a holy book somewhere. The methodology used by many of these advocates is virtually indistinguishable from the methods used by theists. They feel really, really emotionally attached to the ideas. Therefore, they're pushed with no thought, reason, or logic as true. What they essentially say is, this is true because I desperately want it to be true. How often have we heard things like that out of the mouths of Christians? Yet, just like in a lot of Christian forums, places like the Atheism Plus forum do not allow you to question their basic dogma. You can't speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, this seems wrong to me. You'll just get banned. You parrot the party line or you get gutted. That's how these movements operate. The problem is they're moderating their blogs and their forums, etc., to the point where no dissenting voice will ever be heard. It doesn't create a civil climate. It creates a monochromatic climate. And that, in turn, generates a desire for a place to disagree that's been taken away by the original forum or blog. And that leads to a secondary site, such as the Slime Pit, and we're staying along with that, dedicated to attacking the first site. Now, I'm not saying there aren't douchebags on both sides of the debate. I'm saying that the debate will never have a chance to be resolved because the two sides no longer talk to each other. They talk at each other. Overt moderation always leads to more problems than it solves. Their second point reads, go offline before going online. Pick up the phone. When you hear that an organization or member of our community is doing something that you think is wrong or bad for the community, call and talk with them. Find out what they're actually doing and why they're doing it. If you don't have a phone number, send a private email and arrange a time to talk. So much of the time, there's more to the story. And talking to another person on the outside of the issue can help us more fully understand the situation. Plus, a phone call makes it easier for people who are making mistakes to change their course because they aren't on the defensive as they would be after being called out publicly. Now, to be honest, in a perfect world, there's nothing wrong with that, but this isn't a perfect world. People typically don't put their phone numbers, their addresses online for the world to see. It's just not a smart thing to do. Lots of people don't even make their email addresses visible because it invites spam. I'll be honest, I once gave my phone number to someone who disagreed with me, and they called me for weeks on end at all hours of the day and night and cussed at me. For anyone who's watched the Atheist Experience TV show, think Matt from Oslo. So no, I will never put my number out there, even my Skype contact information, for the general public to see. It's just a bad idea. Granted, if someone asks me via email for a voice chat, I might do so, depending on who it is, and then only through Skype because I can block obnoxious asshats. That's something that you just can't easily do through a landline or a cell phone. Trust me, I know that the phone company will do absolutely nothing to stop harassing calls. True story here. About 10 years ago now, I think, there was this company that called people for surveys, and they were really, 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 really belligerent. I can't imagine they stayed in business more than a couple of weeks. When I say, no, I don't want to participate in your survey, they'd make threats. They'd call back over and over and over and over and cuss at you. I don't know who the hell these guys were that had all this time, but I received dozens and dozens of calls. And I called the phone company, and they said, well, they can't block any harassing numbers unless you called and asked for the block before you got the calls. Now, it doesn't make any sense either, but that's what they said. Eventually, I ended up calling the police. But since I had no clue who was calling, since their number was blocked and the phone company wouldn't tell me, and I had no idea the name of the company because they refused to identify themselves, I had to put up with a couple of weeks of constant harassment that I had no way of stopping. Nope, you're not getting my home number unless I know you really, really, really well. Beyond that, though, as I said before, lots of these people are just not being rational in the first place. They've adopted a wholly emotional position, and they're going to cling to it tenaciously no matter what anybody says or does. In fact, most of these people desperately want to be attacked online. They view it as having their beliefs validated. I mean, how many times have you seen a theist say, hey, you're only attacking me because you know I'm right? This is not uncommon. That brings up the other side, though. These people want to be attacked online because it creates controversy. And as we all know, controversy creates money. Page hits, ad revenue, you name it, they make a buck. Now, something I noticed before I ditched the Atheism Plus Free Thought blogs train wreck, but whenever people would stop talking about their controversies, whenever they'd stop arguing about social justice, whenever it wasn't on the lips of thousands of atheists who were flocking to their websites and generating ad revenue, either P.Z. Myers or Ophelia Benson or somebody like that would say something utterly outrageous or stupid, like clockwork, and the torrents of pissed-off atheists would come flooding back. These people aren't stupid. They know that they have to keep people coming back so they get thousands of dollars a month in their pocket. And anyone who responds to their bullshit, anyone who plays their game, is just paying them. Seriously, are you satisfied with making them a bundle of money and dancing on their leash? I certainly am not. If you really want to stop this nonsense, never, ever, 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 ever talk about it again. Never step your electronic foot on free thought blogs again under any circumstances. Vote with your feet. When the money stops rolling in, they're going to have to try another tactic because this tactic no longer works. The third point they make says, listen more. We miss the nuances and differences within the other side once an issue becomes polarized, while continuing to see our own side as filled with nuance and distinctions. There is a tendency to stop listening and treat everyone associated with an opposing position as a monolithic group. People can be painted with views that aren't their own just because they may disagree with some aspects of your own position. We should listen more so we can see distinctions among those with opposing views and start to move toward a more accurate understanding of the issues rather than being deadlocked into two entrenched camps. Now, I agree with this, but unfortunately, as I said before, most people don't want to listen, and even fewer want to be heard. Whether we like it or not, we live in a very polarized society that is getting worse and worse as time goes on. Politically, we live in a nation where people embrace labels wholeheartedly, where people will reject an argument out of hand because it doesn't fall into their interpretation of the liberal or conservative or neoconservative or libertarian worldview. They are entirely incapable of evaluating an argument on its own merits. Now you see the same thing in religion, where people cannot question their own beliefs, and where they will reject any other belief out of hand without even looking at it, just because it falls outside of their own staunch faith. Unfortunately, you see the same thing here, where people hold beliefs entirely emotionally and are unable to entertain the possibility that their beliefs might even possibly be wrong. So many people don't want to discuss their beliefs with those who do not believe them, because that means they have to justify their beliefs with logic, reason, and evidence. And let's be honest, most of them haven't even thought about that. The parallels with religion are undeniable. Perhaps the worst part is the willingness to declare that anyone who doesn't agree with your emotional beliefs must be in some way evil. I keep going back to Richard Carrier's post, where he said that you're either with us or you can slink back into the sewers because you're subhuman. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've listened too much and can see the real justification behind what's going on. When do we get to the point where we just have to reject the proposition wholesale because it's totally and completely unjustifiable outside of a particular emotional worldview? I try really hard not to demonize people just for a particular stance that they take, although you certainly cannot say the same for the opposition. But there comes a time when it's painfully clear that there can be no compromise, no meeting of the minds, no agreement to disagree that they will accept. It's their way or the highway. And if you take the highway, they're going to chase you throwing rocks. That's exactly how it's been on the Atheism Plus side. And while I certainly don't condone the activity, it's no surprise that people, like on the Slime Pit or Elevator Gate, have been throwing rocks back. Unfortunately, it's little more than a bunch of overly emotional 2-year-olds screaming at each other, and trying to reason with either side is really, really pointless. On to the fourth point, which reads, dial down the drama. It's tempting to overuse inflammatory and derogatory rhetoric. It gets attention. We should be cautious about using these tactics within our community because of the long-term damage it does to relationships and morale. When critiquing people within our community, everyone should remember that our goal is to persuade our allies to see our perspective and modify their opinions. Insults don't change opinions, they harden them. Well, to be honest, I think that should have been the first point. So much of this is just internet drama, and it's no different than what you'll see all over the place online. In fact, I'll go one step further and encourage people to recognize what internet drama is and how to ignore it. So often, people spend their time feeding the trolls. And in this particular case, the trolls are incredibly important to the game plan of the Atheism Plus side. So long as they're being attacked by the trolls, they can claim validation for their views via the aforementioned, you hate me, therefore I must be right tactic. Whereas most people would recognize the trolls for what they are and ignore them, the pro-social justice people embrace them wholeheartedly. This is the very basis of their, help, help, we're being repressed design. And of course, as I said before, drama makes them money, so they have a vested interest in keeping the level of drama high. I also disagree that anyone is going to convince anyone of anything. These are emotionally charged issues, and, except for the people at the top of the pyramid who are raking in the moolah, most of the vocal whiners are just clueless foot soldiers, fodder for their betters up the food chain. If your goal is to persuade others to see your perspective, remember how well that usually works with theists. Telling people their views are wrong, especially when those views are a core part of their worldview, simply doesn't work. Providing evidence doesn't work. Hell, we all know that providing overwhelming and undeniable proof doesn't work. This only works if both sides are open to reevaluating their views, and we know that's just not the case. You cannot rationally debate with fanatics, and that's all we have here. You're not going to change their opinions, whether you insult them or not. It's hard to imagine these people having a more fanatical, hardened view than they already have. You cannot debate a rock, and you're a fool if you try. And that's really why I'm convinced that having these debates are pointless, because they will simply never be on a level, rational playing field, at least not so long as emotions are high and logic is low. It's the same thing we talked about last week regarding theists. When you have a theist whose beliefs cannot possibly be challenged, then why would you bother trying to challenge them, except to make them look like a fool to onlookers? But the same is true here, although in this case, the social justice fanatics want to be made to look like a fool, so they can claim victim status. There's a game being played here that most people refuse to recognize, but once you see it, it's unmistakable. It casts the Atheism Plus side in a win-win position. If they, by some miracle, manage to win the debate, probably by debating a complete incompetent who doesn't see the fallacy of their position, then they have a victory parade. If they, more likely, lose the debate, they can claim that the debate was rigged, and the only reason the other side debated them in the first place was because their position is something the opposition fears. In either case, they get to trot out the victim card, and they all get to whine about how hard their lives are because they're so hated and mistreated, even though not a damn one of them has ever produced a single shred of demonstrable evidence that it's so. I'm all for dialing down the drama, but the only real way to do this is to walk away entirely. Only 3 more points to go. Next, we get to be more charitable. We should remember that the purpose of argument within our community is to come to shared and correct conclusions that move us forward, not to score points against the opposing side. To that end, we should apply the principle of charity, which tells us to aim our argument against the best interpretation of the opposing arguments, rather than picking off weaker versions. By applying the principle of charity, we will elevate the discussion so we're actually talking about our real differences, not just engaging in a pointless exercise. I don't buy it, sorry. If I'm going to debate someone, no matter who it is, I'm going to argue against the points that they actually make, not against the most charitable version of the point that I can possibly imagine. It's hardly my fault if the arguments they make are bad. They ought to have a better position. It's not my fault they're saying stupid things. As anyone who knows me knows, I don't tend to go after low-hanging fruit, just because it's easy. I take on any argument head-on, and I deal with what's actually being said, not what I think they ought to be saying. The purpose of argument, whether it's in our community or not, is to arrive at truth. That is the point of any debate, to take 2 sides and present the best evidence for them and determine which one is superior. I know that far too many online debates end up with both sides walking away claiming victory. But guys, you're doing it wrong. If both sides go into a debate with an unshakable opinion that will never be changed, no matter what the evidence is, then you're wasting your time. Go do something else more productive. Unfortunately, that's really the problem here. Both sides hold views that are mutually incompatible, and they're based on an extreme emotional desire. Neither side is really willing to have an honest discussion about the validity of their views. There will be no compromise because neither side can admit that there's anything wrong with what they believe, and neither side is at all interested in looking at evidence that doesn't support their preconceived views. I mean, I'm cool with charity. I'm fine with giving people the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not good with giving any less than my best in a debate. I debate to win, and that victory comes from having the best arguments, not by having the biggest emotional attachment to your views. Number 6. Trust but verify. Before we believe and repost something we see, we should ask ourselves about the evidence provided and the context. It's easy for multiple people saying the same thing to look like a lot of evidence, but if their statements are all based on the same original source, they don't constitute independent verification. We should look at the original data and corroboration from independent sources before believing and spreading claims. Now, this is true across the board. Nobody ought to repost or retweet anything that they see online, or anywhere else for that matter, before they have personally verified that it is factually true. I mean, come on, at least try. I can think of a great example here, one that started it all. Way back when Rebecca Watson claimed that somebody propositioned her in an elevator, and that made her uncomfortable, so guys, don't do that. The idea is fine. Guys probably shouldn't be creepy in elevators. I'm not going to argue with the conclusion, but the story itself is a bit hinky, especially since Rebecca Watson has never been able to identify the guy who supposedly did it, even though there are pictures taken of the group of possible candidates mere minutes before the incident supposedly took place. The guy has never come forward. It's an entirely unsupported and unsubstantiated claim. I'm all for verifying, but I'm not real big on trusting, especially since this whole mess came from an encounter for which we're only getting one side, if it happened at all. This is especially suspicious because it happened with hours of her giving a talk on exactly that subject. Comes off as very convenient and perhaps, just made up to give credence to her ideas. It also goes towards verifying if she's really worthy of trust. She made a claim, and she's been unable or unwilling to support it. Would we accept a theist who made claims to have seen a miracle but couldn't demonstrate it? Would the James Randi Foundation pay out $1 million to a claimant that couldn't prove their claim? So why should anyone be willing to accept a claim, even one as relatively innocuous as this one, without evidence? Where is the original data and corroboration from independent sources? It matters. And finally, number 7, help others along. We should remember that we weren't born knowing the things we know now. To get to the reasoned conclusions that we've reached, we learn by reading, thinking, and talking to others. When we encounter someone espousing a view that we think is based on lack of knowledge or experience, we should remember that we have all held ill-informed views. We should cultivate patience and try to educate instead of condemn. Well, no, we weren't born knowing the things that we were now, but for most of us, especially the people who started as theists and rejected it because it made no sense, at least we got where we are today because we demanded evidence and logic and reason. We didn't get where we are because we embraced another faith after having rejected the one we had. Atheism isn't a faith. It's a lack of faith. We come to it because we actually care about what's factually true in the world around us. While we can encourage those we meet to hold this view, we cannot force it upon others. The world would be a much better place if we could. I'm fine with helping others if they want help. I'm fine with giving a helping hand to anyone who's willing to take it. But when a group of people, one who honestly ought to know better, hold a purely faith-based position and are willing to attack anyone who dares to doubt it, then no, I don't know them a damn thing. I can only offer the help, but if it's rejected, I can do no more. That said, though, that doesn't obligate me to stop pointing out how stupid their beliefs are when they intrude into my sphere. There is a war in the atheist community, not because there are two well-supported and equally well-evident sides, but because one side is acting exactly like the theists they claim to disagree with. There is nothing wrong with social justice. There's nothing wrong with equality. But if you dare to point out to these people that there's no equality in their claims, and that they're just parroting the same kind of faith-based nonsense that we've seen for thousands of years from the religious fundamentalists, they freak out. There just isn't any logic, reason, or evidence to support their claims, and they're unwilling to debate the issue and accept the best supported claim. You just can't help people who not only don't want help, but who vehemently reject help and call you names for offering it. In the end, while I think their heart may be in the right place, all of these various atheist groups really don't understand the problem. This isn't between two groups of equally rational atheists. It's between two groups of equally irrational ones, or at least equally immature ones. Atheism Plus and social justice have nothing whatsoever to do with atheism. People need to realize that you can be an atheist and, well, something else at the same time. You can't just lump every position you have under the same umbrella and pretend it's all atheism. You also can't pretend that just because you're rational in one part of your life, say your atheism, that automatically makes you a rational person in every other aspect of your life. That's patently untrue. And for you idiots on the anti-atheism plus side, you're a part of the problem too. It's just not that funny to go around poking the retarded kids because it makes you laugh. In fact, it makes you look worse than them. Everybody needs to knock it off and grow the fuck up. That would be worthy of an open letter to the secular community.
You believe what? No. Oh, no.
A couple of weeks ago, I did a segment examining the biblical flood of Noah. I looked at it from the perspective of the absurdity of the actual narrative, and I promised that I'd come back and look at where the Hebrews got the story, and I'd also look at the actual flood geology of the Middle East, which absolutely proves there was no real flood upon which the biblical story was based. Well, since I'm flying solo again this week, it might be the perfect time to delve into this topic. So many people, when they look at these Bible stories, really only pay attention to what is said in the Bible. They disprove the story and really go no further than that. Unfortunately, it's really only the beginning of the story. Not only do we need to concern ourselves with what ended up in the pages of the Bible, we really need to understand where it came from and the mindset of the people at the time it was written. It's only by truly understanding how these people thought and why they wrote what they wrote that we can be clear on what the Bible is and why it is the way that it is. Hausdorff, who guest hosts here from time to time, has a really great blog called Hausdorff's Bible Blog, and if you haven't read it, you ought to take a look. There's a link in last episode's show notes, and I'll throw one in the sidebar links since he's on pretty often. He reads a chapter of the Bible 5 days a week and reports on what it says. One thing he doesn't do, however, is really look into the background of the stories he relates. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. I'm certainly not going to criticize him for that. But out of studying just the stories come a lot of questions. And a lot of those questions cannot be answered without doing further research. Now, I guess I'm lucky that I have a wife who's a trained cultural anthropologist and a huge, huge library of books upon which I can call if I run into questions in my research. I mean, certainly the internet has been a boon to anyone who's really interested in further examining the backgrounds of religious myths, so long as you are careful and do not assume that any blog that you come across that agrees with your preconceived notions must automatically be true. That's what so many Christians do. They only read things they already believe are true, and use that as a justification for believing what they believe is true. Research takes time. It takes cross-checking facts, examining evidence, going back to original sources, etc. It's not something that's particularly easy, but it is something that's very rewarding. One name that everyone ought to be familiar with, at least anyone who's interested in myths and folklore, is Joseph Campbell. He's probably the best-known folklorist, even though he died back in 1987. He wrote many books on worldwide mythology and was quite clear that he viewed gods and goddesses as untrue. He wasn't a strenuous atheist by any means, but he certainly had no faith in any religion, although some, like Dr. Tom Snyder, considered him a pantheist of sorts who viewed all life as interconnected. Among his books that are the most relevant here are, well, his Mass of God series, where he examines the similarities of many worldwide mythic traditions. For those more visually inclined, there was a long series of interviews that he did on PBS with Bill Moyers called The Power of Myth, which I think you can probably find on YouTube, but honestly, I haven't looked. Let's just say it's out there someplace if you want to go looking, and leave it at that. There are many others that are interesting to read, but for the novice, starting with Campbell seems to be the obvious, easiest, and probably most accessible. The reality is that there are flood myths around the world. The reason for this is quite simple. Most ancient cultures grew up on the banks of rivers or on the shores of the sea. They lived in what are called floodplains, areas that are prone to flooding, and therefore which are most fertile for their crops. Floods were commonplace in their lives, and it's obvious that many cultures, in fact most cultures, adopted some sort of flood myth into their folklore. They've identified somewhere north of 150 different and distinct flood stories around the world. But as interesting as the flood myths may be, maybe it's even more interesting that lots of cultures have no flood myths at all. Ancient Japanese myths, for example, most of them do not include floods. We can trace where most of these myths come from and how they move from culture to culture and how they combine with each other by simply tracking the details. We know, for example, that the Hebrew myth, which came primarily from the Sumerians and the Akkadians, picked up some elements from Hindu myths, as these elements show up in the telling much later. I don't want to get into too much boring detail here. Suffice it to say that Joseph Campbell has a really good write-up for when and where the Hebrews got their myths in one of the volumes of the Mass of God. I want to say it's the one dealing with Occidental mythology, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me, and I really don't want to go look right now. Now, there are some claims that the Noachian flood myth originated with the flooding of the Black Sea Basin. Dr. Walter Pittman and Dr. Bill Ryan of Columbia University think that the best explanation for a real flood can be found there. The area that is now the Black Sea was an inland lowland until about 5500 BCE, when the Mediterranean broke through the narrow seawall and flooded it catastrophically. We know for a fact that this was a major flood that killed lowland settlers. Even people like Bob Ballard have done underwater surveys and found evidence of ancient habitation. That much we know, but we really have no reason to think that's the single source for the area's flood traditions. There may be no single source. That's the one thing that really bugs me. From people who accept that the flood is a myth, and that includes a lot of atheists, but they think that there's still some event that they can point to that explains where the ancient peoples got their myths. That really isn't how ancient peoples operated. It's much more likely that there isn't a single flood, or even a local flood. There's somebody built a boat, put a bunch of animals on board, and floated away until the flood had passed. Many people think that ancient peoples thought and act as we do today. And that's just not true. To them, these myths were stories. They were never intended to be historical records of things that actually happened. They were parables about ideas and beliefs that they had. That's why they had no problem, when they met another culture, with lifting story elements from the myths of these other cultures and incorporating them into their own stories. Most modern people simply do not understand that. They assume that because we're more literal today, that's how it always has been, and that's just not the case. In fact, it's pretty doubtful that most ancient cultures even took their own myths literally. For most, they were probably little different than Aesop's fables. They were there to tell a story and teach a lesson. They were not history, and they were not fact. But if we need to look into geology, so be it. I've got a friend, Dr. David MacDonald, who's a professor in the history department at the University of Illinois. A long time ago, he sent me a paper he wrote on the flood geology of Mesopotamia, where he details the archaeological and geological records of the area. He tells a story of Dr. Charles Leonard Woolley, an archaeologist in the late 1920s when biblical archaeology was at its height. This story demonstrates the failure of biblical archaeology and why so much of it has had to be revised or even thrown out bodily. In his digs in the 1928 to 1929 season, he located evidence of a flood in his excavations of the early dynastic royal tombs of Ur. According to Woolley, by the time I had written up my notes, was quite convinced of what it all meant, but I wanted to see whether others would come to the same conclusion. So I brought up 2 of my staff, and after pointing out the facts, asked for their explanation. They did not know what to say. My wife came along and looked and was asked the same question, and she turned away, remarking casually, "Well, of course, it's the flood." This is the kind of scholarship that used to be commonplace among biblical archaeologists of the day. They would go out into the field, make a discovery, any discovery, and then they would scratch their heads and stroke their chin and declare, "Aha! I will have to look at the Bible and find out what I discovered." It was just so badly done that virtually all archaeological discoveries from the first half of the last century are in question. And as modern archaeologists go back to look, they're finding a huge number of them very badly misidentified. There were actually several different floods that were identified in scientific papers as being evidence of Noah's flood. Of course, these floods could be dated across a huge swath of time, ranging from 3500 BCE to 2600 BCE. Clearly, these could not all be evidence of the same flood, a flood that lasted less than a year according to the Bible. The archaeological discoveries within the floods also told a distinct story. Had Noah's flood been real, you would have seen human-produced cultural relics from before the flood geology, and thereafter it would have been absent since all the people were dead. That's just not the case. The same pottery, the same jewelry persisted before and after the flood layers. Clearly, these cannot be considered evidence of a literal flood. No modern-day scholar seriously believes that the biblical flood was the origin of the story. Clearly, there are many details between the events in Genesis and the events in the various Mesopotamian flood stories. The oldest existing Mesopotamian story is far, far older than the Hebrew version, and it contains distinctly Mesopotamian details that cannot be claimed to have come from a lost earlier Hebrew version. The most well-known is the Gilgamesh epic, although there are other parallels in the Atrahasis epic and the incomplete Sumerian deluge myth. The Sumerian king list also contains a reference to a flood. The list, first composed around 2100 BCE, claims to contain a list of kings and dynasties of Mesopotamia from the time when the first kingship descended from heaven. It has problems, to be sure. I mean, some of the earliest kings on the list have lifespans that make Methuselah look like a piker. Despite the problems, though, the list does contain kings which are independently listed elsewhere, making it at least possible that they actually existed in reality. It claims that, after a number of very long-lived kings, there was a flood which swept the land, after which it records that the kings once again descended from heaven to continue their line of royalty. You want to know how similar the stories are between the Bible and the Mesopotamian versions? Listen to this.
The wickedness of men so displeased Enlil, the supreme god, that he decided to swallow man up in a huge flood. Enki, protector of men, pleaded with him, but in vain. so Enki decided to preserve a remnant. He asked Zusudra to build an ark and to take animals in pairs on board with him. After 6 days and nights of storm, the world was submerged. On the 7th day, the storm abated. Zusudra released a dove that, finding no resting place, returned to him. On the 8th day, he released a raven that never returned. Mankind was saved.
I really don't understand how anyone who has any inkling of these stories can think for a moment that the biblical stories are older, more accurate, or even remotely original. All we have to do is deconstruct the stories and look at the surrounding area and find virtually the exact same stories, only much older. It's not difficult to trace mythic elements from one culture to the next, to date the changes by their appearance and style, or to realize that all of these myths are just that, myths. They have no existence in reality. There was no worldwide flood. There almost certainly was no single local flood upon which these myths were based. It's a story told to pass along a cultural message, which is taken far too seriously today by theists who have no clue what their forefathers actually thought or wanted or intended. It's just bunk, and it should be treated that way by all intelligent and rational humans. Finally, I've had a lot of people ask me about something I've referenced a couple of times before, the story that occurs after the flood where Noah gets drunk and falls asleep naked, is found by his son, who he then curses to be a slave forever to his brothers. This is taken from the ancient Hindu source called the Fish Chronicle. It's a little too long to read on the air, so I've put it in the show notes, and it's absurdly obvious that one was taken straight from the other. Considering that the Hindu source dates back to between 4000 and 6000 BCE, two guesses which one is older, and the first one doesn't count. Go read it for yourself and see what conclusion you come to. That finishes up my examination of the flood story. If you have any questions, you can certainly email me or put it in the comments, and I'd be happy to do what I can to answer your questions. Thank you. Well, that does it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the show. These are really, really difficult to do alone, more so than you might even imagine, because there's no one to play off and have a discussion with. Therefore, I want to once again encourage anyone who is interested in being a permanent co-host or even a regular guest host to contact me as soon as possible. I'd really love to see this podcast go on. It's fun to do, but I want it to be something that people enjoy, and I just can't do it alone. I need your help. That said, I know that sometimes things seem pretty negative in atheism land, that even though the non-religious are the fastest-growing quote-unquote religious segment of the population, that it seems hopeless, especially when looking at some of the major news stories that we do. I wanted to relate a quick story, something that made me feel good, and maybe make you feel good too. As I said, over the past weekend, I went to WonderCon. It's a comic book, science fiction, fantasy, gaming, whatever convention that's held in March every year. It is not an atheist convention, although, if I had to wager, I'd say there are a lot of atheists that go there. Even though, if you read my convention reviews on my blog, there are some very, very religious people who show up, like the Christian Gamers, if you can believe it, and their logo is funny, so I'll throw it in the show notes, and the Christian Comic Art Society. However, I was sitting in a panel, and I saw an older gentleman who was wearing a t-shirt. On the front it said, "I teach science," and on the back it said, "I don't care what you believe." I'll put a picture of that up too. Honestly, it made my heart skip a beat. Not only do you have someone who's proud to be educating our children and educating them in science, which really matters, but one who's adamant that someone's beliefs don't mean a damn thing. That's amazing. All right, I invite everybody to come back again next week for another show, and keep your fingers crossed for a guest host. My name is Cephus, and I'm an out and proud atheist. Take care.
You've been listening to the Bitchspot Report with your host, Cephus. You can follow me on Twitter at Bitchspot1. Please check out our podcast website at report.jdragononline.com. You can watch our podcast on YouTube at youtube.com/The Bitchspot Report. We're also available on iTunes. The link is at our site. Please subscribe and rate us. It really helps us a lot. We'll be back next week for another fact-filled episode of The Bitchspot Report. Please tune in again.